wait just a minute to get started. Okay, hello everyone. My name is Carolyn Bradley, and on behalf of Campbell & Company, I would like to welcome you to How Can I Use My Data to Inform Fundraising Goals? Thank you for joining us today. Before we begin today's presentation, I'd like to quickly go through some logistics for those of you who may be new to our webinars. Please close any programs other than GoToWebinar that are running on your computer. We recommend calling in with a telephone instead of using your computer speakers. And if you experience any visual issues, please send a chat to Campbell & Company or contact GoToWebinar at the number on your screen. Today's webinar will last 1 hour, and you'll earn 1 continuing education credit that is good with your participation with CFRE International. Within the next 24 hours, you'll receive an email from GoToWebinar that includes information on how to download your certificate. In that same follow-up email, you'll also receive a link to download today's slides, along with a link to the recording. We do welcome questions throughout the webinar. Please use the questions box in the GoToWebinar control panel that should be on the right side of your computer screen. We will also hold time at the end of the webinar for the Q&A. And now I'd like to turn it over to our presenters today, Caitlin Martin and Molly Alexander Hogan.
Great. Hello, everyone. Thank you, Carolyn. So nice to be with you all. My name is Caitlin Martin. I'm a senior consultant with Campbell & Company's Strategic Information Services practice. I'm located in our Chicago office and coming up on 8 years with the firm this fall. I recently moved over to our data focus practice from our fundraising practice, where I'd worked until about 6 months ago. And I moved over because I love data. I'm sure, like many of you on the call, really just love to use it to maximize our clients' fundraising opportunities. So I'm really happy to be in a role now that lets me focus on that. And continue to work with incredible clients like my co-panelist here, Molly. I've been working with Molly and her colleagues at the Guthrie Theater for coming up on a year now. It's my great privilege to work with her, and I would love to pass it to her to introduce herself now.
Thanks, Caitlin. Hello, everyone. I'm Molly Alexander Hogan. I'm the Director of Development at the Guthrie Theater. I have been at the Guthrie for, it'll be 3 years in March, and it's probably notable that the first 11 months were spent pre-pandemic, so I didn't even quite have a year under my belt when we experienced what we've all gone through in the last 18 months. So I'm so looking forward to sharing our experience with you today, and I look forward to any questions you might have.
Great, thanks, Molly. So I will walk us through our agenda to start. We'll begin by talking through Campbell & Company's approach to how you can use your data to inform your fundraising goals. And then we'll move into hearing from Molly about how we applied this approach in our work with the Guthrie. We'll return briefly to what's required to do this type of work successfully for your organization. And we want to make sure to leave lots of time for Q&A because we know that you all derive a lot of value from the chance to ask Molly and me some questions. So I'll go ahead and dive in to talk a little bit about our approach to this work. I want to start by talking about the various factors that can influence or should influence your fundraising goals. And on this slide, I'm talking about a campaign goal, but really this is also applicable to your annual planning. And our counsel to clients is always to ground your goal in a strategic plan that informs the what of your campaign and, of course, has associated price tags with that. So that's, of course, a key factor in influencing your goal, what you actually want to accomplish. But we also need to ground that in terms of what you can actually expect or hope for from your donors. And some of your donors we can speak with and get a real sense of their inclination to support your organization. And we certainly recommend doing that as part of a feasibility study. But of course, we can't get to everyone. So we want to make some assumptions about the capacity of everyone we can't speak with and how much of that capacity they might be inclined to give to your organization. So those two pieces are the capacity and the inclination are where data can be really helpful and where we really want to focus our time today. So at Campbell & Company, we are big proponents of using a gift table to organize your planning. Your fundraising goals should be based on a close look at your gift table and how the prospects in your database align to what's needed for the goal that you're considering. So I'll walk through these columns here briefly for those of you for whom a gift table may be a new structure. The first column is the gift level that we might hope for. Then you see the number of gifts at each level. Then you see the number of prospects you need to get those gifts, qualified prospects, and I'll return to that in just a moment. Then you see the subtotal dollars, the cumulative dollars, and the percentage of our total. And in this instance, we're looking at a $10 million table. So a couple of things I want to point out here. The first is that classic 80-20 rule that seems to apply in so many places in life. About 80% of our $10 million total here is coming from about 20% of our count of donors. So we want to, help your teams by making this as top-heavy an effort as possible. The other thing I would point out is that 3-to-1 ratio that you see for prospects needed to the number of gifts. So we want to be prepared to ask 3 people for a gift in order to get 1 gift at that level. And then the last point to point out here is qualified prospects versus identified prospects. So in addition to their capacity, you want to have a sense that a prospect has the inclination to support you at that level. So it's not just finding 3 people who are capable of giving to us $1 million, but 3 people whom we could actually ask for that amount and have a chance of actually securing a gift at that level. So once you've built out the gift table for your initiative, your campaign, or your annual program, you want to then work to map your prospects to the table. And to do that, what you need to know is what is your prospect capable of doing? What's their capacity? Are they ready to do that now or soon with more cultivation? And you might have an anecdotal sense of that, but a lot of organizations really only know a fraction of the donors in their database. So we want to encourage you to do an unbiased analysis of this so that people don't fall through the cracks. Also, of course, people's wealth changes and they don't necessarily raise their hand and tell you that when their wealth changes, even if you do have a chance to sit down in conversation with them. So this sort of analysis can help you align these prospects really based on the science, and at the same time want to allow a lot of space for human insights, which we'll talk about today as well. So at a high level, these are the steps of the process when we engage in what we call a capacity analysis at Campbell. So the first is that we do a wealth screen of the prospects in your database. And then from there, we're able to quantify the capacity of everyone in your system. And then we use some more data to segment the prospect in your system based on whether they are a prospect or what we call a future prospect, meaning somebody who's not yet ready to give at their capacity level based on insufficient engagement with your organization. And then once we have that capacity and segmentation for everyone, we can align them to the gift table for the initiative that we're tracking. So now I will walk through each of these steps in a little bit more detail for you. So the first is that wealth screening step. And wealth screening is based on publicly available information about an individual's assets. So this might be their real estate, stock holdings if they're part of an SEC filing, things that you can really find in publicly available information. And then a percentage of those assets is what comes back as their capacity. And across all of these vendors, typically this is representative of their ability to give to all of their philanthropic interests over a period of 5 years. So always important to remember that the capacity you're getting back is not equivalent to an ask amount. Sometimes it is, and we'll talk about that, but a lot of times it's not. So we facilitate wealth screening with our strategic partner donor search, but we can work with other vendors too, including Blackbaud, iWave, Wealth Engine, and there are others as well. And each of those vendors provides a slightly different score and approach to doing this wealth screening, but the overall principle is the same. So with the well screening complete, you can then begin to quantify capacity. And there are, as I started to mention in the previous slide, a few pitfalls of well screening. The first is that lots of folks' assets are not public. So for everything that you can find on the books, you can guarantee that almost like a glacier, there's a lot of other assets underneath that are not visible. And the flip side to that is that the results are sometimes overly dependent on real estate, which is not a liquid investment. So you have to balance, we're not seeing everything, and some of the assets that we're seeing are not necessarily liquid, but they are usually signifiers of that other wealth. Another tricky thing here is individuals who give anonymously. You may not always be able to track the gifts that they've made, and that can even include donor advised funds these days, which we know are such an important giving vehicle for many donors. So, well screening is vital. We really encourage our clients to do it, but at the same time, also want to think about other potential definitions of capacity as well because of some of those pitfalls of well screening. So those other possible definitions of capacity could include past giving to you or to other organizations. Also, any internal ratings that you've developed through prospect research, or planned asks that you may have for the prospects in your database. So when you start to line up all of these different numbers and metrics, it can kind of sometimes seem overwhelming. You're not sure which one is the truest representation of their capacity, but we do feel it's important to try to get to apples, meaning that 5-year measure of capacity. So once you have your definition of capacity, you can move on to segmenting your donors, because capacity is only a piece of your puzzle. We need to understand how likely is your organization to benefit from the capacity that you've uncovered. And this really is all about affinity. And there are a couple of different ways that you can measure affinity and how we measure affinity when we're doing a capacity analysis. The first is an RFM score. RFM stands for recency, frequency, and monetary, and it's a model that compares all of your donors against one another in terms of who has given the most and the most often. Also want to think about different types of gifts, and do some types of gifts show more affinity for your organization than others? So for example, a transactional membership or a tribute gift might be a less strong signifier of affinity than an outright gift. We can also take a look at engagement scoring. So this goes beyond their giving record to you to look at things like event attendance and volunteering and meetings with staff, other factors that really show they're truly keyed in. In Molly's case, of course, ticket buyers and ticket attendance would be a great signifier of engagement. We can also look at predictive modeling. So this is where you would build a model of what a major donor to your organization looks like, and then line everybody else up against that model to see how likely they appear to be as a potential major donor. That's a great affinity flag. And then finally, prospect stages. So if you have flagged somebody as in cultivation through the great major gift work that your team is doing, it's likely that that prospect has stronger affinity because they're working closely with your team through a relationship management strategy. So we would want to factor that into our segmentation as well. So lots of variables and moving pieces here, but the end result is that we have identified a group that looks ready to give sooner, and then a group that seems to need more effort or time and should probably be deprioritized for the time being as your team works through its strongest available prospects. So then once you have your capacity score and your segmentation, you can go ahead and align them to the gift table. So you can see these yellow columns that have been added to that same $10 million table that we looked at a few minutes ago. And the first column you can see is identified prospects. So this is, again, that near-term group, and you can see that they are aligned there by level. And then you see a surplus or gap column, which compares the number of identified prospects to the number of qualified prospects that we need. And you can see in this case, we have a couple of gaps at the top of the table and some nice surpluses there in the middle. So you can help to close those gaps by taking a look at the future prospects, that final column, and thinking about strategies to potentially bring those prospects more close to your organization. And you can also think about a trickle-down strategy. So someone may not give at the level at which they're identified here, but hopefully they'll give somewhere lower in the table, which can help to fill in some of your gaps. So this is really the science, and does the science say that we can do it? But then there's lots of additional work that's part of this analysis. That's really the hard work, although maybe some of my analyst colleagues would disagree because sometimes the data wrangling is the hard work. But there's a lot more to come here, and it starts by really vetting the data, and I look forward to Molly talking about how her team did this. So we want to really do a thoughtful review of every name and every capacity and every status to see, did the science bucket them correctly, or might we change some things? And then once you feel good about that data, you want to import it into your database so that you can use it in reports and in queries and as you do your segmentation for your day-to-day activities. You also want to really think about the opportunity that has been presented and whether or not you have enough staff to mine that opportunity to really take advantage of it. Often in these analyses, we find that we've identified more prospects than the team is capable of managing, and this can really be helpful to building your business case to leadership about further investments in your development office. From there, you want to take a close look at portfolios. So everybody that has frontline responsibilities, we want to make sure that each slot in their portfolio is occupied, hopefully by a top prospect. And if not, that there's good reason for that. So someone who has plan giving responsibilities, for example, it might make sense that they would have somebody who's lower capacity in their portfolio than perhaps a major gift officer might. And just a word about portfolios, because it's often a question we get. We like to say that someone with no other responsibilities that's just working with donors on major gift strategy can have a portfolio of about 100 to 125 people. So helpful to keep that in mind. And you'd want, again, the majority of those people to come from the top prospect pool that we identify through this analysis. It's also important to think about context. So one of the slides that always makes people's eyes pop open in these analyses is the difference between where these prospects have been giving so far and where they appear capable of giving. And the bigger the leap, sometimes the harder it is to get a prospect to really close that gap. Not always, of course, because a campaign can be a really excellent opportunity to get someone to think differently about your organization and really an opportunity to ask them in a way that they haven't been asked before. But that past giving context is really important. And then finally, we want to look at the activities that the team is undertaking and whether or not they are the types of activities that will help someone make that leap between where they've been giving and where they're capable of giving. So, is the team doing the one-on-one meetings and the type of deliberate cultivation that will really advance those prospect relationships? So just that, I know it's a lot of work, but it really pays off in terms of the opportunity that is painted through it. And I would love to turn it over to Molly now to talk us through how her team has taken advantage of that opportunity.
Thanks, Caitlin, and thanks to the whole Campbell team for having me today. It's been a real pleasure and necessity to have Campbell supporting our work on this campaign, particularly during this very strange time. So I'm just going to start by giving a quick overview of the Guthrie Theater. Some of you may know the Guthrie is in Minneapolis, Minnesota. It is a nearly 60-year-old regional theater. And 15 years ago, we opened the facility you see on this slide on the banks of the Mississippi River. It was an area of the city that was completely underdeveloped at the time. And the Guthrie was really one of the flagship institutions that moved to the area. And as a result, we saw a real economic revitalization of the neighborhood. So we're thrilled with our facility. We're very, very fortunate to have it. And of course, that reflects the work of a major campaign that happened over the time of 15 or 20 years ago. There have been a number of other smaller efforts in the interim, but it wasn't until really 2014 when the Guthrie determined that one thing they needed to invest in very carefully and thoughtfully was the actual art that was going on stage, and to look at ways we might expand the opportunity to open our building and have it used more as a public asset. So we're looking at doing those things through this effort. The Guthrie has, of course, historically on an annual basis served hundreds of thousands of people, including students from the area. Of course, it's notable to say that for the last 18 months until about 2 weeks ago, we've not had a single thing on our stages. So it's a bit of a strange time to kind of relaunch a campaign initiative, and simultaneously it's been a great time because we've been able to really deep dive, focus on the data, focus on all the great work and infrastructure that Campbell's helped us put into place. I would also just mention one thing that prompted us to use Campbell & Company. On March 10th of 2020, we really relaunched this campaign. And by March 13th of 2020, our doors were closed, our stages were dark, rehearsal rooms were empty. We needed a partner to help guide us through this moment. We initiated, of course, an emergency fundraising initiative when we lost over half of our revenue, basically, in earned income, so our ticket sales, in the course of the first 6 months of the pandemic. So we were looking to offset what we could from a fundraising standpoint. And during that 6 months, we more or less put the campaign on hold again and said we'll come back to this. And by the time September, October of 2020 rolled around, our co-chairs for the campaign, our steering committee, everyone was getting ready to go, but it was very difficult to discern what the path forward looked like. Clearly, we still don't have an end to coronavirus, and in the midst of all of that, there was, of course, the murder of George Floyd in our own community. So there were so many factors that we were taking into account as we were navigating the restart of the campaign. And so we decided to engage Campbell & Company, particularly because we'd had multiple false starts at the campaign starting all the way back in 2014. And now we are started and we are going. And just as I hopped on this call with Caitlin, we were getting word of a major gift coming through for the campaign. So it's a good day. We also needed a plan to ensure the success. I mean, a board of directors with, they'd been through this a few times. There was the start in 2014. We had a leadership transition at that time. Our former artistic director, Joseph Dowling, was retiring, and they were bringing in our new artistic director, Joseph Hodge. There needed to be a moment where we paused to say, we want to pursue our new artistic director's vision and his strategy for what the Guthrie will be into the future. It paused at that time, and it also paused in 2017. There was an initial outreach to a local consulting firm to help us craft the messaging and get ducks in a row to get this off the ground at that point in time, and it just didn't come into reality, essentially. It was a time of transition. The board said we need to stop and create a new strategic plan, which is exactly what happened. And happily, that strategic plan has now served really as the basis and the guideline for the case that Campbell helped us develop. And we brought Campbell on, very importantly, to have an analysis of what we needed to create that sort of operational plan and to work closely beside us as we got the campaign off the ground. Part of that initial work did, of course, include a capacity analysis. And even though the Guthrie had a long-standing relationship with one of the vendors that does this work, we'd not taken the time in quite a few years to really analyze that data and see what it was telling us. You can move to the next slide. So the goals for the analysis that Campbell did for us, we wanted to confirm the feasibility of our campaign. Back in 2017, the board approved an $80 million campaign, but they hadn't really done a deep dive into the data to see if that was actually feasible. So the number, 80 million, was well socialized among our board and volunteers, but the reality of can we get there was not clear to the group. We also created a top prospect list, and I joined the team, as I mentioned, a year prior to the pandemic, and was just sort of starting to build relationships with those major donors and our board members. And I didn't have all the relationships I would have liked to have had because the pandemic created new challenges. Normally, we visit with our donors, our prospects, when they come to the theater. Well, in light of the fact that we had no shows on stage, the work was really about, can I connect with you via Zoom or a phone call, or, so we were working to try to come up with what are the new ways we can connect with our donors, and yet what a strange way to build or start a relationship with someone who's giving so generously to the theater. And then we were building a case, and I think this is really important for staff investments. I'm glad this was in Caitlin's slides as well, but, one of the great challenges of many arts organizations during the pandemic has actually been that we reduced our staffs. And we are now just rebuilding folks. I've just hired 2 new staff members in the last couple of weeks, thank goodness. But we did lose people, and we lost a lot of our infrastructure, and that was really challenging. What our data ended up showing essentially was that we did need to build out, particularly our individual giving team. We were able to add some campaign officers, but I was able to take a case to my organization's leadership to say, we need to invest here because we are missing opportunities with the donors who are really among our top prospects and with whom we're not having, one-on-ones or close relationships simply because my team hasn't had the bandwidth to take that on. We've also needed to understand what level of increased activity and giving would be needed. In other words, we have a group of very, very, very deeply committed donors, mostly on our board of directors, who give major gifts and for whom we are their top priority or one of their top 3 priorities. I also expected that we had a lot of other people where we had not scratched the surface of their potential. And I wanted to know what kind of giving increase will we need to see from those people in order to achieve that $80 million goal. So what we found, what Campbell helped us find, was that we have over 2,000 prospects with a capacity of 6 figures, so $100,000 or more. We had insufficient staff to manage the opportunity. We had an opportunity to ask bigger, which was, of course, great news to hear and to share with my board of directors and campaign chairs. And the total database of that had nearly $500 million in philanthropic capacity. Now, we, of course, understand we're not everyone's single most important priority when it comes to giving. And so don't let your executive directors make it a $500 million campaign just because you potentially have the capacity there. I think what it shows, though, is when you're seeking to do an $80 million campaign, there is theoretically plenty of resource in our pool to achieve that number. This was all very buoying to my co-chairs, to my committee, and to my board of directors. Next slide, please. So how have we acted on it? Well, in every conceivable way to this point. We've been proceeding with the campaign at our hoped for goal. And that was such, as I said, a reassuring moment to know for certain we had the capacity among our list of top prospects. And it really, again, built the confidence of our artistic director, our executive director, the board, and everybody affiliated with the campaign. Vetting the data in waves. So this, of course, I think is some of the most fun work of campaign. You know, when you're sitting down with a list of people, you're segmenting that list. So as an example, we're currently very, very focused on our former board member list. And at an organization with a 60-year history, the Guthrie has about 400 plus former board members to consider. So, you know, we are going through them in small groups, in large groups, one-on-one with particular committee members. We're disqualifying those that haven't been engaged much. We're rating them in terms of their closeness to us to ensure they're really a prospect and not like a future prospect, as Caitlin was describing. Can we ask them now, or do we need to put a cultivation plan in place to ask them in a year from now? We reviewed the capacity scores and made adjustments. Caitlin also shared this. The screening data is fabulous. It really can help you hone in on what somebody might be capable of. And at the same time, we as major gift officers, development directors, we tend to know those people better than the wealth screening will really reflect to us. And so there were many times, particularly with our board of directors, as we were analyzing them, that we discovered, oh, we know that this person has this thing that isn't really reflected here in this data. So we were using that in real time to influence, okay, how do we want to narrow in on an ask amount? And I think that's a really important part of the discussion. We've also reviewed every single board member, regardless of their capacity level. I think this is also critical because we have a goal of getting 100% board participation in this campaign by May 30th, 2022. So we have probably 6 to 9 months to really make that happen. And as a result, we spent a lot of time there up front determining who should ask, what should we ask them for, and the data that Campbell was helping us with was just instrumental in determining that path. We also have subsequent rounds of review occurring all the time that take us to the lower levels of the gift pyramid. And I think that's also really important work. We have in our plans a community phase where we want to engage people who may not be able to make the sort of major or leadership gifts, but we do want them to feel a part of the next phase of the Guthrie's iteration of our lives. And so as a result, we want to know who are those people out there who've been subscribers for 10 plus years? Who are those people who buy multiple tickets to a Christmas Carol every year? That's the kind of information we're looking at, and how can we approach them and start to build dialogue and relationship with them as well. In addition to that, we've been bringing suggested ask amounts to our volunteer leadership, identifying solicitation teams, and building strategies to cultivate these prospects. And that work is, for me anyway, very exciting. It's exciting to see our board members make connections, to understand the data, to use it to inform our choices as we press forward with these conversations. And as I mentioned earlier, we're already having some great successes. So that's really rewarding. You know, we are working to hire additional staff to address this opportunity that we have with so many really wonderful prospects, but we are in the process of rebuilding virtually our entire organization. The Guthrie Theater, very early on in the pandemic, laid off nearly 80% of our staff. That left us with about just shy of 50 people for a long period of time. It was a really tough time. We're still working on it. I'm sure many of you are experiencing some of the challenges in the space around hiring. We certainly are. And you know, this is a bit of a slower process than I'd like it to be. And yet, as I mentioned, we've been able to hire 2 really great folks to join our team. We're looking to hire 3 or 4 more. Send your prospects my way. We're excited to really get that going. We know there are so many individuals who really need that one-on-one attention from us right now, and we just can't wait to get in conversation with them. You know, as our staff come on board and we're able to focus more on our work with donors, we'll rebalance our portfolios. And that was something that I really appreciated Campbell talking with us about. One thing that Campbell discovered in this process is that my team, they all actually currently have appropriately sized portfolios. So myself and anybody who works for me, we have portfolios that are pretty robust, that give us a significant number of major donors to interface with regularly. And so it really is critical. It was a critical point that we needed to look at adding people to solve for how do we cover the rest of those prospects. And we still won't be able to cover everyone, but I feel confident that our time with donors will be well spent as we press forward, and particularly as we start production again. Some lessons learned. I think this is really important to say that you need to remember that this research is directional, and it is no substitute for deep prospect research or sitting down with a donor to qualify them for a gift. So I mention that because we get into these really interesting conversations among board members where they see someone they know on the list and they say, no, they can't do that. They won't do that for the Guthrie. And we're trying to use the information that we've received, but also the information we know about a person to inform that. And sometimes folks are right about those people, and sometimes they're not right about those people. So it's important and good and relevant to have these conversations and to take the time to do that work. It's also valuable to track the information in your database, whatever database you have. Our staff turnover over time has led to some gaps in these relationships and information that are really difficult for us right now. So we're trying to fill in the gaps where we can and lean into our board members who've been part of these relationships for longer than we have to try to learn, you know, what are we missing here? What do we need to know as we walk into these conversations?
Thanks,
And
Molly.
then, yeah, this
Go
is you,
ahead.
Caitlin.
Oh yeah, sorry, I was unmuting. Sorry about that. Thanks, Molly, so much. It's really nice to have a few minutes to sit with you and reflect about about what we've been through and what you're doing with it. And I just have to give you kudos because I know how strapped you are day to day, and you are doing all of those things that you described. And it's just amazing to watch you and your teamwork. And I so appreciate you being here with us today. Let me quickly go back to what is required if you want to do the exercise we described or a version of it that you work through with your own teams. So at a minimum, to do the wealth screening, you do need a home address. Home address, not business address. You won't get a good finding if you just have business addresses. So certainly working to collect as many home addresses from your folks as you can. These vendors do offer append services if this is not something that you have, or if you think you need to update your home addresses. So would encourage you to talk with your vendor of choice about their offerings there. And certainly the results from your wealth screening will be better if you have middle initials so that you can find the right John Smith, and then spouse names as well. Also really important to getting as solid results. So that's just kind of a data integrity issue that will maximize your results as you move through them. If you are tracking relationship management fields, so these would be things like portfolio assignments and activities or contacts with donors and proposals or planned asks and prospect stage. These are all fields that if you're doing the analysis with Campbell & Company, we will use to help just make it all that much more robust. So certainly encourage you to track those fields in your CRM of choice. Also would probably suggest that you have prospect research software to help you in vetting the results. So we will give you the capacity score through this, but you, as Molly described, will want to vet it, verify it. So if you have access to a prospect research software, then you can do that work on your own ongoing. And each of the vendors that I mentioned has a different prospect research software to which you can subscribe. And then finally, the biggest, most precious resource is your time. And it does, take time to put these results to work. So don't want anybody here with us today to underestimate or think that this is the silver bullet. It's not, but it will give you a great head start. And we, of course, want to, make this as light a lift for you as possible and stand ready to be your partners if it's something that is of interest to you. So with that, I think that brings us to the Q&A. I hope that we've had some activity in the chat. So I'll invite Carolyn to join us again and help us facilitate that.
Thanks, Caitlin. I don't quite see any questions yet, but I know we do have a couple of softball questions for me to ask you. So if you're interested in those, I'm happy to ask them.
Sure. Thanks, Carolyn.
Yeah, so some questions for Molly. Did your gift table have any gaps? And if so, how did you address them?
Yes, our table did have gaps. We identified a gap at one of the highest levels of our gift chart. So a couple of things we talked about there. We know that not everyone will make their gift at capacity, as I mentioned earlier. So we're not their only philanthropic priority. So how would we fill in those gaps? We also have had a traditionally strong history of corporate giving in the Twin Cities and at the Guthrie specifically. Now, for so many of us, that landscape has changed just in the last 10 years, and in the Twin Cities particularly, it's only just happened in the last, I would say, 2 or 3 years. So that's challenging because we didn't have that information in our screening, obviously. So that was information we went back and added at a later time. And then I would also say we had additional future prospects with capacity at that level and higher. So we'll be thinking about, okay, not just who we're approaching today, who may be able to do a gift at that level, but also we'll be thinking a bit about who can we put a great stewardship cultivation plan in place with, particularly as, again, we move back into producing live theater, where we can put them on a path toward a major ask at one of those levels. So that's kind of how we've addressed the gaps in our particular gift chart.
And I'd love to just jump in, if I can, Molly, to talk a little bit more about the point you mentioned about corporate prospects and how they factor in here. It's tricky, right? Because there's no ability to screen them for their assets. I mean, the ones that are publicly available, you can of course understand something about their financials, but you don't necessarily have a great picture of, how they spend their philanthropy. So this is a place where it's really helpful if you have a corporate person on your team or a prospect research person on your team to try to be scanning the landscape for other gifts that those corporations are making. And those are the asks asks, the gifts to other organizations that we can factor into their capacity rating. So if Molly knows that, Best Buy, which is there in Minneapolis, has made $1 million gift to another organization, they can assume that they at least have the capacity, maybe not the propensity, although hopefully they do, but the capacity to make a gift at that level, and then we're able to include them in the analysis at that level. But without that benefit of prospect research, it's true that corporations tend to kind of come in undervalued in this analysis, and at places like the Guthrie, where they do have that really rich history, we did feel like they could help us fill in some of the gaps. So just wanted to add that.
I would also add to that, Caitlin, that we had a number of individual prospects who have high-level positions at some of the corporations here in the Twin Cities. So one thing we've done really carefully is take the data and the capacity analysis around those particular individuals and tried to marry that to our corporate strategy. So if we're in conversation with the head of the Best Buy Foundation, who are we in conversation who is in their C-suite, and so we're trying to marry all of that together and have a really thorough and thoughtful approach with the corporations, but also with the individuals associated with them. And that's taking it an extra step. But for that reason, I'm really grateful we established a corporate subcommittee of this campaign to really help pull all that strategy together.
Great point, Molly.
We did just have another question come in. The question was, how often should an organization conduct wealth screenings to reevaluate fluctuating capacity among donors?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I can start, and then Molly, I'd love to hear your thoughts on it as well. Our typical recommendation is that this data is good for 2 to 3 years. I will say that with many of the wealth screening vendors, kudos to them for ensuring their revenue. They'll ask you to sign a multi-year agreement, which will mean that you'll have an automatic ability to rescreen your donors on an annual basis. That is certainly for the most mature and sophisticated shops, they are doing this ongoing annually. But for many of our clients, we recommend doing this every 2 to 3 years. And I would also say, that in recent years, we've just been through a lot and people's financial pictures have changed, sometimes for the better during the pandemic, as I think many of us in fundraising have found. So more frequent screening for even just through one-offs for people whose situation you suspect may have changed can really be invaluable. But Molly, what would you say? When are you thinking you might want to do something like this again?
Yeah, the Guthrie has a history of doing it annually in the fall for some of the reasons you mentioned. And I will say, I've also been in an organization where we did it every 2 or 3 or maybe 4 or 5, stretching it a little years. It's a lot to manage on the daily to keep that information updated. The pro of having the contract with that kind of an organization that does the wealth screening is that if you need to do deep dive on a particular individual or entity, you can do that more readily with that contract in place, and they can take your research just a bit further than maybe what you even receive from them in the database. So that is one pro to that, having that relationship in an ongoing fashion. But yeah, I would say if you can swing it, do it annually because of the changes and the fluctuations we've seen. And I think in particular in these last 2 years, we have seen so many changes. I know there's a bit of anxiety about like when's the bottom gonna drop out of the market, and we haven't seen that happen yet, but that's something I'm hearing in some of my donor meetings is a little sense of caution. But really, I think it's a good time to update your data at this particular moment overall.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I just can't help but think for a minute about our food bank clients, and I hope that some of you are on the call today. And it's not restricted to food banks, but they are just such a great example of just the influx of new donors that they experienced over the last year and a half or so, and just trying to understand, like, how can we prioritize all of this opportunity, and screening is such an invaluable tool for that. So.
Yeah, I know retention is on all of our minds. We've had so many people too at the Guthrie, even though our stages have been dark, who've come through for us in very significant ways, and how we retain them is a huge question. So that's my next Campbell and Company webinar suggestion: donor retention.
You're hired, Molly. You're hired. Thanks for that question.
And we did have another question. This one mentioned that it could be an oversimplification, but is there some sort of formula for how many analysts and fundraisers there needs to be to raise a certain amount of money in a certain amount of time? This person gave an example of reaching a $10 million goal over a 2-year campaign. Would you need 3 analysts and 5 frontline fundraisers, or is it more nuanced than that?
That is fascinating. So I like that this person is thinking about the staffing required, because of course we need the staffing to get the dollars, but I would encourage you to think about it as a gift on a gift table. Here's another plug for the gift table here. To think about, and actually 10 million is perfect because that was the sample that we had here in our slides today, because I think it will depend on how those dollars come in. And the more top heavy your pyramid is, the fewer staff theoretically that you need because you're managing all of them. That said, I think we all know that sometimes those biggest gifts, you may not be able to manage quite as many people because there are a lot of touches needed to get those really big gifts. But if you have a more bottom heavy pyramid, and Molly, maybe you could speak to this a little bit because I think you encountered that a bit. If your pyramid is a little bit more bottom heavy, you probably need more staff to cover the opportunity just because the volume of asks that you'll need to make is higher. So I don't mean to sidestep the question, but I think focusing on how you think the dollars will come in is a really valuable step there.
Yeah, I will share with this group that the Guthrie had in 2018 around 5,500 donors, and in the last fiscal year, which just completed for us on August 31st, we had over 10,000. That happened in a very short period of time. It happened during a pandemic, and we, to Caitlin's point, we have to look at ways to engage with those donors, and we're looking at multiple opportunities. We're doing multi-channel fundraising from them. So we're doing a call room, we're doing direct mail, we're doing email, social, all the things that we can do to get in front of those folks. But now our job, as I said, is to retain them. And part of that has to be that you grow your staff. You cannot have 10,000 donors at any level without having additional staff to help manage them, and certainly to cultivate and steward them toward their next gift. So it's a huge concern on our end as well. And I think Caitlin's advice here is right about using the gift chart. See what your gift breakdown is in terms of the giving levels, and see where you really need to invest in staff.
Right. And then once you have that pyramid, you can go back to a tip I think I shared, which is that everyone who doesn't have any management or marketing or whatever hats they wear, if their only responsibility is to be working with prospective major donors, they can probably work with 100 to 125. So then you can probably do some math based on your table to figure out approximately how many staff we might recommend. I hope that's helpful.
The person said that it was helpful, so
good.
Appreciated. And then we have another softball question to ask, which would be, when do you think you might do an exercise like this again?
Oh, yeah, as we kind of enter the second half of our campaign, it'll probably be very helpful to take a look at this type of analysis again. So I'm really thinking about as soon as next summer, to be honest with you. We've been advised screening results are good, like Caitlin said, for 2 to 3 years, but they should be refreshed because the financial picture changes. And so we're really sensitive to that and the changes that are happening in our environment right now. And we're also, I mean, the Guthrie continues to be in a bit of a sensitive spot around all of this. We are having audiences back now at capacity, but we are not able to host our opening night dinners or any of our traditional events that engage ticket buyers, subscribers, donors, etc. So we also have to be cognizant of where we are in terms of our own reopening to the public. And so it's sort of, once we can have that initial opening night dinner, or once we can have that initial sort of behind the scenes moment, to engage people again, it will be interesting to see if the tenor and tone of our conversations begin to shift, and if we think, man, it would be a good time to look at this again or refresh it again to see if there's any new information, because now we're kind of rolling back in close relationship with people. I think the arts in general are in a pretty tricky time around that. And I bet, and I don't want to go too far out on a limb, but that healthcare is in a really tricky spot with this right now too. Yeah, that is important to us to continue to look at it and to continue to sort of bend our plans to the data and what it's telling us.
Yeah, that's great, Molly. And I also think along the way, we're going to continue to pick up such valuable information, so every ask we make, we have our hoped for amount and we have the amount that we end up getting, right? And so it will be really helpful for us to study that. What we call that a yield, right? What was your yield on what you asked for? And then we can apply that, to the capacity we find in the future and see like, okay, based on, if you're getting 50% of what you asked for, what does that tell us about what your prospect potential truly might be, and really gives you kind of as we go along, a more and more specific and detailed path about how we can conclude the campaign successfully. So
I would add maybe here, if it's okay, Caitlin, just a couple of thoughts. I mentioned the starts and stops of our particular campaign over the course of really 6 years' time. One of the things that happened over that time was that there were a number of very major leadership gifts that were secured, which in the one sense is incredibly fabulous to be a development director who's gifted nearly $30 million to start rolling. But to your 80-20 point at the very beginning of this, those individuals who contributed really roughly between 2014 and 17 totaled under 15 individuals contributing a total of $30 million. Incredibly generous and wonderful. But those folks are now out of our prospect pool, right? Like they're out, and of course we hope we might be able to ask them for a second gift as we move forward, perhaps later, depending on the timing of everything. But my top hottest prospects with capacity have already made those gifts. And that has been, I think, a really unique challenge to our campaign, and has meant that we have had to rely on the data so much more significantly, because it's not just as simple or straightforward as who are those leadership folks? We know them. They've already made their gift. It's about finding really the next tier of leadership gifts. And that gets really tricky really fast for all the reasons someone might imagine. So I just wanted to mention that, because I think it's strange to have starts and stops like this, but it's also strange to have the gift of so much in the door already and your most major prospects kind of off the table.
Right. It's true. Yeah, you're having to go to new sources, even beyond your board. I mean, your board is also a great significant source, and it's a sizable board, but even that group alone is not going to cover it. So yeah, digging further and further. Unfortunately, in the arts, we have the benefit of, hopefully more and more people coming through our doors. And, the Guthrie has a really uniquely special focus, I think, on getting new communities of people in through your doors.
Yeah.
And wanting those people to be a part of this philanthropic effort, wanting this effort to represent the whole Minneapolis community. So yeah, we want to make sure that their ability to contribute is reflected in the screening data as well. So yeah, it's a good point. Any other questions coming through the chat, Carolyn?
I don't see any other questions, no. Is there anything else that you thought was really notable, that you thought was really important to know?
I think we've covered a lot today. I want to make sure that our contact information is up here on the screen for anybody who has specific questions. Molly, do you feel we missed anything that you want to make sure we cover before we wrap up today?
No, simply just that I'm so grateful to have had the consultation of the Campbell team and certainly the support in a period of time when we were down so many staff members. That was really pretty invaluable. And that you all continue to serve as our partners as we press forward from a strategic perspective. It's been terrific to have you.
Well, thanks, Molly. And it's just the great joy for all of us to be on the front lines a little bit, or a little closer to the front lines with everything that you all have been through. Just really appreciate the opportunity. Appreciate you all joining us today. I hope you've picked up a nugget or two that you can take into your work in the weeks and months to come. Wishing you all great success wherever you are, and please let us know if we can be helpful to you. Thank you, Carolyn. Thanks, Molly.
Thank you very much. That's all the time we have for today. So thanks again for joining us. Look out for our email with the webinar recording and slides, and please be in touch if you have any questions. As Caitlin said, the contact information is on the screen. We encourage you to sign up for future Campbell & Company webinars, so stay tuned for information on our next webinar. Thanks again, and enjoy the rest of your day.